Hello, this is Jack Jackson. This is the start of our Week 9 playlist for the history of mathematics. This is going to be a little bit shorter one, but it's going to be about the mathematics in the 17th century. As always, I like to start by acknowledging some of my main sources. I want to thank Todd Timmons, my colleague, who provided his lectures and lecture slides for me as a source. Um, a History of Mathematics by Carl Boyer and A History of Mathematics, an Introduction by Victor Katz are two of my main sources there. And the MacTutor History of Mathematics is a wonderful online resource. So let's start with just a basic introduction to mathematics in the 17th century. So that'd be the 1600s, the Common Era. And here's a map of Europe around that time, right about in the middle of that century, around 1650. First of all, you can see a rather large Ottoman Empire here centered on present-day Turkey, but then extending well beyond that, way out here. Russia has grown to be a larger country, has expanded by that time. Poland, Lithuania areas here. The Holy Roman Empire, which is present-day Germany and beyond, is here, but it's kind of broken up really into a more of a loose collection of smaller states. England is here. France has become a major power. Spain and Portugal have definitely become big seafaring powers. In fact, during this time, and in fact, from 1400 as far back to 1600, so we're looking at, the Middle Ages, the colonial expansion has started to really take place and continues through the 17th century with uh, with colonies being established in British colonies established in the what's presently now the United States, Jamestown, Boston, and so forth in there. Um, and so as we you can see the expansion here of uh, of of the countries where we have British and French, Spanish, and Portuguese, particularly exploring the world and establishing colonies and colonizing the local people that were in these areas. So, meanwhile, while all that's going on, we have some mathematical advances coming out of the Renaissance. Now, some of this we've already talked about in our previous thing on the Renaissance because it was the late Renaissance actually came into the 17th century in terms of some of the mathematical ideas. Certainly, astronomy was a big thing that we've already talked about a bit. In our last playlist, we talked about Galileo and Kepler. Much of their work, especially Kepler, actually happened in the early 17th century. That included some work with making telescopes, more correct versions of what's going on with motion. Um, Heliocentric solar system model became more prevalent and Kepler was able to establish that we had elliptical planetary motion and just a general increase in experimentation in science moving toward the scientific revolution. This laid the groundwork for later work by Newton, who did important work in mathematics and physics, and he was able to explain why planets moved in a planetary motion, or at least explained a theory that would explain that, whereas Kepler's work was more just empirical and looking at the evidence and come up with a reasonable model. Along with that, we have the mathematical notation. We talked the last playlist about how that goes forward, and we start to see um, algebra, for example, written from completely in words to more and more symbols. That work was continued uh, evolving towards modern notation. Some of the important folks along that path were Oughtred, Harriot, Girard, and Descartes. Those folks worked in the 17th century and moved this idea of mathematical notation even further forward, starting to get to the point where things are starting to look uh, like we would write equations today, for example. Um, Logarithms we talked about in our last playlist as well, Napier and Briggs, and so that overlaps into the first part of the 17th century as well. And of course, there was a lot of theory of equations that happened in the Renaissance, working with solving um, polynomial equations and so forth, and that continues to move forward into the 17th century and working with the fundamental theorem of algebra. The things that I'm going to focus on this playlist are analytic geometry, number theory, projective geometry, and probability theory. So Descartes, let's spell that correctly. There we go. No, still one of them's wrong. There we go. Descartes and Fermat were big figures in this entire century, from the first, well, really through the whole century, but especially through the first part of the century. And Descartes and Fermat worked a lot in analytic geometry. We'll talk about that on our next video. And then later we'll talk about number theory. Descartes, Fermat, Mersenne were some of the folks that worked on that. Projective geometry was expanded. Desargues was a particular important there. Probability theory got its start during the 17th century with the work of Fermat and Pascal, and later Huygens, and then barely into the 17th century was Bernoulli as well. He was really more in the 18th century. One of the Bernoullis. There's a whole family of those we'll talk about more in the next playlist. Playlist after next, because the next playlist is I'm going to start talking about calculus. And calculus was really developed, or at least started and founded in the later part of the 17th century with folks laying the groundwork for it really even before the 17th century, but especially in the 17th century with folks like Descartes, Fermat, Wallis, Cavalieri, Gregory, Barrow did a lot of work that laid the groundwork for calculus. And then Leibniz and Newton were actually the ones that actually worked on that and developed calculus for the first time, followed by work with the Bernoulli family and some others that moves on into the 18th century. So, the reason why this is going to be a little shorter playlist is a lot of the early 17th century stuff I kind of included as extensions of what happened in the Renaissance, and then I'm going to separate a whole playlist for calculus, so that leaves some work on these blue areas here. The century kind of got off to a rough start. There were some people uh, uh, um, executed for their beliefs. They became martyrs. In particular, there's a guy named Giordano Bruno, who was an Italian friar in the year 1600, the very, very start of the 17th century. He was burned at the stake for heresy, and his punishment was primarily due to theological issues deemed heretical by the Inquisition. He quickly became a martyr for philosophers and scientists because of his support of new ideas, specifically the Copernican heliocentric cosmology. Galileo Galilei, who we mentioned earlier, became an integral part of the scientific revolution with his observations using his newly invented telescope, and that provided evidence for the Copernican system. He also published his works that lay the foundations for modern physics, laying the groundwork for later work by Newton. But he too is found guilty of heresy by the Inquisition. His life is spared, but he's sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his days. The first permanent settlement in the New World at Jamestown, the building of Taj Mahal in India, the very long reign of Louis XIV in France. There's plague and fire in London, Salem witch trials. Peter the Great ascends to power in Russia, expanding Russia's size and influence there. We also have Descartes founding modern philosophy, as well as doing some important work in mathematics. And of course, Sir Isaac Newton is sometimes called the father of modern science. So all that's going on. So a lot of transition from the first of the century, where the Inquisition is actually actively seeking out and stifling to the point of death ideas that they feel are not in line with their own, to a complete revolution in science and mathematics at the end of the century. So it's a pretty advanced century. Things start to really move toward a truly modern way of thinking. So we'll dive into a few details in the next couple of videos.